Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Stratagoy video. Ryan here with the conclusion, I think, to the series of Math Hammer videos I've been doing lately, where we compare the way some of the factions we've seen thus far, their Warscrolls, how they look in transition from 3rd edition to 4th edition, but just with respect to the melee and missile output changes mathematically, obviously being a Math Hammer video. Now, I say that this is kind of a continuation, kind of an extra addendum, because it started off as just being Stormcast, Skaven, and Luneth, the 3 armies that had the most Warscrolls. But then I asked if you guys wanted to go see anything else from the faction focuses that we've seen thus far, and I got some good responses, namely for Soulblight, the Orruk War Clans armies, or at least I should say Ironjawz and Kruleboyz, and then Ogor Mawtribes. So that's what we're going to be tackling today. So for those of you that sent in your requests in the comment sections, thank you so much. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope everyone at home gets something out of this as well, even if those aren't the units you're most looking forward to. All right, let's get into it. So, as before, we've got some ground rules here. I'll try to cover these even faster if I can, since I've done it in every video. First off, we're only looking at Warscrolls and rules we've seen thus far. There might be something that's leaked here or there that we've seen since the faction focuses, but I'm trying to just keep it to the information we already know. I'm only looking at missile and melee output for obvious reasons that it's harder to quantify mathematically all the other great things that a Warscroll brings, which is kind of to my following point, that things like movement shenanigans, how tanky you are, which is definitely a little bit, more than a little bit, mathematically calculable, but ultimately isn't something that's as easy to take into account as it is here, and other kinds of buffs and debuffs that you can be giving out. Those are just harder to quantify. So it doesn't, just because something got nerfed or boosted does not mean that Warscroll is bad, even if points remain the same, which is to my following point. I'm assuming here that points are going to stay roughly proportionate to what they currently are in the 3rd edition iterations we have after all the points changes that we receive quarterly with the battle scrolls. So if we're expecting about a 10 to 20% points increase across all armies in general, then I would assume that we're going to keep the units relatively at the same value. Obviously, if something gets nerfed 10%, but its price goes down 50%, then it's probably actually a buff. But that's we're trying not to look at that because we don't have the points values, or at least I don't. And then lastly, I'm mainly concerned with the percentage improvement or degradation of a profile instead of the raw numbers of how many more wounds output you'll be doing. I'm looking more at just how much better you got, because that's easier to compare from one army to the next, and raw damage can be misleading sometimes. So this is a more standardized kind of way of looking at things. But you've heard this story before, especially if you're a person who's asked for this content, because you've seen these videos. So let's just get into it, starting with Soulblight. Alright, so the 2 units we had that were requested were Laukavai and Radikar the Beast, so the 2 of our named characters here. So Laukavai, how we're going to be doing these, if you haven't seen one of these videos yet, is we're first going to be looking not in detail at the Warscroll, because you've already seen it, but we have the Warscroll on screen. Then I'm going to cover what changed from the old Warscroll to the new one, and then we're going to be looking at a graph that shows, based off of a save value, from a 6 to a 5, 4, 3, and 2 plus save, we're going to be looking at whether the profile got worse or better. If it goes below 0%, then it got worse. If it goes above, then it got better. So we're looking for it to go above, ideally. The last column that you'll see on those graphs, EV/AV, and I'm sorry that the numbers are covered up here, but that's just what happens when the buffs and nerfs go both directions, is expected value average, meaning taking a simple average across all 5 of those save values, a 6 plus all the way down to a 2 plus. And then that gives you kind of a single number that can help you process what it's going to be like if you see all saves equally. Okay. So what changed with Laukavai? Well, her talons, which is her second profile there, had one better rend. I'm saying one better rend on these videos just because the way we framed it in 3rd edition and earlier was a negative number, and so making it like +1 rend actually would be a bad thing, and it sounds like it's a good thing, so they always had to say improve or worsen the rend. So I'm trying to keep in line with that, just so it's clear. But moving on in 4th edition, it'll always be positive numbers. So if it gets +1 rend, that's a good thing. But anyway, this would be functionally +1 rend in that terminology. So it cuts better. And then the tail, which was a 3rd profile that we had, and the fact that the old Laukavai could technically give herself the ability to do 2 monstrous rampages because she was Avangori and she could pick an Avangori monster. She could pick herself. Got swapped for her new rampage, which is in the lower corner there, which is the Impaling Talons. Now, so I'm going to split this into 2 different Warscrolls, or 2 different slides here. One is the nerfs, or mainly nerfs, and one is the buffs. So let's talk about the nerfs first. Because she lost her tail, which was putting out a little bit of output, we are largely seeing nerfs in general. And so I was also, when I was looking into, so first off, let's say the blue columns there, the blue bars, are the base profile. So not using any of the extra mortal wounds things that she could do. So by losing the tail against a weaker saves, she's worse. But then as soon as we get to a 4-up save or better, she starts to peak. Why? Because the talons, which had more weight potential anyway, got 1 better rend, so they're cutting through a little bit better. But you'll see with the expected value average, the very last column there, that technically averaged out across all columns, it's a slight nerf to the base output. Now, the orange is versus a stomp. Why? Because every single turn she could do, by having 2 rampages, of course, as any monster could have always done stomp, but she could have done, say, the most important one, which would be roar, and also stomp, which would feel kind of like she got it for free, especially if you're not trying to do it with any of your other monsters. So I said, well, let's compare the new base profile versus the old profile plus a stomp that was going off on a 2+ to do D3 mortal wounds. And you see, of course, that the orange bars are even lower because the extra 2 mortal wounds, well, 1 and 2/3 after you factor out the, I think that's right, after you factor out the you needing to roll a 2+, reduced her output quite a bit, especially considering you lost the tail as well. But then if we add in, so we let her do the stomp, but then we do her new rampage against a wounds characteristic of 3, and I'll explain why I picked that one. We see that it's a little bit better, but we're not quite there yet. Now let's look at what a rampage does on the red box there in the bottom left-hand corner. So if this unit charged, so that's the other one, getting to use roar and stomp, was something you could do every turn regardless of whether you charged or not. So this is more conditional. If you charged, you can pick an enemy unit in combat with it, so within 3 inches, roll a die, a d6. If the roll is equal to or less than the target's health characteristic, so its wounds characteristic, inflict an amount of mortal damage on the target equal to the roll. So if it had a wounds characteristic of 1, so basic infantry, then it would only go off 1/6 of the time and would do 1 mortal wound, which wasn't that impressive. Now, so I just didn't even bother putting that in the graph here, even though I did calculate it for 1 wounds characteristic of 1 or 2. But here against a wounds characteristic of 3, this is right before it starts to turn positive. So let's switch to the next slide. So here's the buffs part of it, and you see the image looks a lot better here. So these are all taking into account using stomp with the old profile plus wounds characteristic of 4 or more for the Impaling Talons rampage that she has. So you'll see the worst performing is the blue bar, which against a save of a 6+ over 5+ is still worse. But from a 4+ save or better, as long as you're against a wounds characteristic of 4 or more, Laukavai is doing more output, assuming that she did a stomp with the old version. Then you'll see when we get into wounds characteristic of 5 or more, it's positive for all saves. And then with a wounds characteristic of 6 or more, which is obviously means it goes off every single time, then it's doing quite a good bit more here with green. And you see that she's up to an expected value average of about 17%. better than her old profile. What does this tell you? Now, I've been trying to say in these videos that what we see with these stats can kind of tell a story of what this unit is doing now. And one of the things it's doing is it's trying to go monster hunt a bit more. That might seem maybe like weird, but she did get +1 better rend on her talons. This rampage really wants to go into things with 6 or more wounds characteristic or health characteristic, and that would include heroes too. So hero hunting as well. She's obviously got her subtracting 1 from rend characteristic of melee weapons, which she always had, which is great against things that are bigger and have scarier rend. And then obviously she's adding to the companion attacks of a Soulblight Gravelords monster. Now you'd say, well, why can't she use that? She's a monster, but she doesn't have companion attacks, so it doesn't apply to her. So I feel like the function here, which used to be kind of making an Avangori list tick a little bit more, as she was like a war master for Avangori and had some Avangori specific buffs, but that build wasn't all that strong, and as we know, at least until we get the next battle tome with the index, we don't really have the individual dynasties anymore. And so now I think she's mainly just been kind of re-geared to being a bit of more of a hero or monster hunter. And that's kind of her thing. Anyway, let's move on. All right, so Radikar the Beast. There isn't much to say here, really. He's got a lot of techie stuff. He's a little slower than he used to be because he doesn't have run and charge. I think he had that before. There's some things going on, but in terms of output, his claws got +1 damage, so that's cool. So that's his main profile, not those of the Vyrkos Bloodborne that kind of come on his base, which don't unfortunately benefit from the Vyrkos Bloodborne ability in Call to the Hunt that we see here for +1 to wound, unless of course once we see the Vyrkos Bloodborne they actually have a wounds characteristic of 4+ and then it's built in. But anyway, and so he always had crit mortals, but he didn't have a damage characteristic 3. It did damage 2 when it went through. So now the crit mortals also follow suit, which is nice. Otherwise, nothing really changed with his output, and so you just look at his output here against all kinds of saves, and it's hovering between like a 27% to a 34-35%. On average, we're looking at about just under a 30% improvement with his output. Of course, the movement shenanigan that we're seeing with his once per turn army end of any turn, if he's not in combat, it can move D6 and then go get in combat, which is kind of cool. I think that's a big thing. And then, of course, all the other stuff that he's got going on as being a buff piece, and he's a wizard now. So there's all kinds of cool things that are going on with this unit. I'm curious to see if you'll be able to use him and the other Radikar the Wolf at the same time, but probably not because they kind of have a Marathi thing going on, or at least old version of Marathi, where only one could be on the field. Anyway, yeah, so he got buffed, but not too much to say about this guy, at least not until we see some more faction stuff. All right, so moving on to the Orruks section of our coverage today. I'll be starting with Ironjawz. Brutes were actually a popular demand, a popular request for this video. So starting with the Brutes. Amazing control unit with their turning off, being able to contest objectives for units with a health characteristic of 1 or 2, which is fantastic. I mean, almost broken in some circumstances, but really great. But this unit, what we're really talking about is their output. So there's a couple things here. They used to have 2 weapon options. I've basically compared them to their old Choppas instead of the other option. I forget what it was called. The reason being that if you compared the other 2 profiles against each other, the Choppas were better against all saves but a 2-up save. So considering how rare a 2-up is, especially now, I decided it was more fair to compare the output and stat line to that of the Choppas. If you do so, then it was -1 attack and -1 to hit from that profile. But they got +1 damage, which goes a long way. So if it was 4 attacks at 1 damage, and now it's 3 attacks at 2, you have a max amount of 6 that could go through instead of 4. And they also gained an extra point of rend against infantry, which helps them cut through and makes them more reliable. Now, they have an elite weapon called a Gore-gruntas, which got +1 damage, so it's doing more output too. Now, it's important to say that the champ of this unit used to be able to take 2 or 3 different weapons. I forget how many, but I did the math on it, and the way the math works out is of the 2 or 3 weapons, whatever it was, one of them really was the smart idea because they had the same expected value, if I'm remembering this correctly. But if you got +1 to hit on them, which is an ability I'm about to cover, then the one of them ended up being significantly better. So when I compared them here, I compared them to a unit that was using Choppas, and then the champ was using the profile that got better on the when you got +1 to hit. I want to say that was the Boss Claw and Brute Smasher. But anyway. So yeah, they also lost an ability they used to have to get +1 to hit if they were against a wounds characteristic of 4 more. So they wanted to go monster hunting. In a sense, or monster or bigger targets hunting. In a sense, that got changed or interchanged with anti-infantry. But keep in mind, infantry nowadays, in 4th edition terminology, doesn't mean small models that are smaller than brutes. It means Kroxagor as well. It means Kurnoth hunters. So there are some things that used to be a wounds characteristic of 4 or more that do qualify still for that extra rend. So that's kind of cool. And if you really need to get +1 to hit, you can just all attack them, of course. So anyway, if we look at the graph, the blue is their base profile. So that's with the what am I trying to say here? Just no buffs added in, and you can see that the new version is just empirically better. It's averaging out to something like a 17% improvement. Now the max I called max because they both versions had a way of getting better. The old version had the +1 to hit, and then the new version has against infantry +1 rend. So I compared both of those. Like say you're in the prime scenario to be the best version of yourself you can be without using all out attack or any other army buffs or something. In that case, the new version is actually worse against the 6-up save, but against all other saves it's better, especially a 2-up. It's worth noting though that the expected value average is still considerably lower. It's about 7.5% better or so. Okay, so those are the brutes. Interesting is, if I'm not mistaken, someone in one of our comments said the brutes got worse, and I mean, I'm happy to hear their argument, but I've crunched the numbers, and I don't see where that argument is coming from. So for those of you out there that are brutes fans, especially considering their amazing denying of control, this is a great profile. I would be happy to run this unit anytime. They look great. Okay, so now we're on to an extremely complicated unit, the Grunta with Hack and Crew. This was a relatively new addition to the Ironjawz, so new in fact that if you look in the app, it doesn't appear under Warwick Warclans, it appears under the Ironjawz Battletome Supplement section, which is silly, but it is what they did. It was a relatively new addition, I want to say like in the fall or winter, and with the new kits like Big Pigs and all the other cool melee options they've got. And I fully expect that this is part of the wave that they were trying to push to kind of separate the two armies from Kruleboyz, which we'll get into soon. Now, the Mawgrunter is with Hack and Crew is one of 3, if I'm not mistaken, Big Pig options. 1's a hero and 2 were, battle line in this kind of Army of Renown, or maybe another build as well. Maybe if you're the hero was your leader, but of course battle line's gone anyway. So, gosh, a lot changed here. The most important thing is that momentum system is totally different. Now, I considered the possibility of trying to kind of come up with a reasonable prediction of how easy it is now compared to then to get up to the amount of momentum points you're trying to get to. That said, I've read through the rules, and even after the kind of like rework that they did to help with the momentum score, like get reduced every battle round instead of every turn, as it initially was written, I still think the new momentum score, and you Mawgrunter players out there can let me know, but I think the new momentum system is going to be much more forgiving for keeping your momentum high and meaningful. Plus, a lot less things are based on it. For example, it used to be run and charge was based on, of course, you don't have it anymore at all. Obviously your output, the rend characteristic of the kill choppas, if I'm not mistaken. The damage of the Mawgrunt is tusks, but that's still the case. And I want to say the speed of the unit. So the unit's a lot less dependent on getting your momentum up, and even then, I still think the momentum's a lot easier to pull off. Okay, so assuming all things being equal, so so the riders got -1 to hit, and they don't have any momentum rend on the one ability I mentioned. The tusks got +3 built-in attacks, but they got -1 to hit and -1 to wound, and one worse rend. And their damage went from D3 plus X to a flat 2 plus X, and X being kind of like a momentum tier. I'll get back to that in a second. And the trotters, like the feet, I guess, -2 to hit but +1 to wound, and 1 better rend. It seems like a lot of nerfs, but there's some buffs mixed in here too. So let's check it out. Now, I grouped these by momentum tiers. Why? Because right now you can start with 0 momentum, and then you can go up to 1, 2, or 3. So you have 0, 1, 2, and 3. So that's 4 tiers. And then it used to be that you started with 1 momentum point, and then I think it was something like in pairs, like 2 to 3, 4 to 5, and then 6. Something like that. But it was in 4 different tiers, starting from 1 momentum to 6, and then it was kind of divided into 4 sections. So I've kind of tried to compare across those tiers now. So what you'll see here is this is the melee of the Hack and Crew. We're not looking at the Rampage just yet. So the Momentum Tier 1, first off, Momentum Tier 1 is going to be the dark blue, the first bar there. And you can see on average, if you haven't built up any momentum, you're worse now than you used to be. Okay, so we're starting with that understanding. But of course, as soon as we see momentum tier 2, 3, or 4, you're above and you're performing real well with the new version. And the cool thing is the new version is much more consistent and reliable to be able to get those momentum points in my estimation. So those tusks are still getting +1 damage on the tusks every time you get a new momentum score. So at best, if you're getting up to the top tier, we're seeing about a 17% increase on average across all saves. Or even if you're only getting to the second highest tier, you're seeing a 12% improvement. So nice to know. As long as you're hitting a tier, it's performing better. Okay. So let's take a look at the Rampage situation. So the Rampage used to be, it's changed a lot, but basically it was only versus a wounds characteristic of 4 or less that you could do it. Now it's for each unit it crosses. It's in the movement phase instead of at the end of the charge phase like Rampages are currently in 3rd edition. It was that you rolled a d6 and then it had to be less than your momentum, and then it did that many mortal wounds. Which of course, if your momentum score was getting nerfed, it wasn't doing that much. Now you roll a d3, and then on a 2+, a d3 2+, it does that much mortal damage per unit that you crossed across when you moved your normal move across everything. So what is my chart? What's that all about? So what we're going to see here is the old version, which is in the light blue, and then I compared it to just 3 different scenarios where you do the new Rampage, where you go over just 1 unit, where you go over 2 units, and where you go over 3 units. So this is no longer comparing, unlike what we've done before where we see a percentage improvement, this is showing how many mortal wounds. So this is a different type of graph, but you can see, because the new version is all 3 of the bars to the right in each one of the momentum tiers, by the way. So that's your momentum score at any given moment. Of course, it's flat now. It stays the same for the output of the orange, green, and light blue bars because the new version of the unit its Rampage isn't based off of its momentum score. In fact, it just gives you 2 momentum points because it counts as your move for the turn instead of running or charging. What's it called? Those are flat. So those are just points of reference to see how good the old version was. And so you can see that the only time the old version even catches up or improves is if its momentum score was a 5, then it's equivalent to the new version going over 1 unit. Or If you had a momentum score of 6, it was somewhere in between the new version going over 1 or 2 units. So 2 units is better, 1 unit is worse. So overall, the Rampage got better. And so if you think about it, considering how much easier it is to go get momentum built up, and considering the last graph we saw said that as soon as you get to momentum tier 2, which, by the way, is different than what we're seeing here. These are not split into tiers. These are split by the literal momentum value of the old version. Thus, we see all the way up to 5 and 6. But anyway, as long as you're on momentum tier 2, which I believe was momentum. Let me just check it out while I'm talking about it, because then I can just kind of get straight in there. Let's see, Hack and Crew. I got to pull it up in the app because I don't have it on my computer. Let's see. So the old momentum tiers, yes, it was 1 for the first tier was 1 momentum score. Then the second tier was 2, 3. The third tier was 4, 5, and then 6. I believe that's what I said before. So basically, what we're seeing is you have to get up to basically momentum 6 to have this do more damage. And then if we go back to the other chart, momentum 6 would be the top tier. Even still, even though it's not as big of a difference, the new version is outperforming. So really, at the end of the day, I see this unit as having gotten a buff. Okay, hopefully that was sufficient for everyone that wanted to know about the Hack and Crew. Okay, so now we're on to some Kruleboyz. I found it hard to find art for these guys for whatever reason, but I like this piece. It's just not the guy. The kill boss on Nashtooth is kind of like your normal cavalry dude. There's not a whole lot to say here. His mount got +1 attack, but -1 to hit, being more mounty, I guess. It also has 1 worse Ren than before. And the whole unit lost +1 to hit when charging, which, as you can expect from everything I just said, 3 out of 4 of those things are nerfs. Its output only went down. So if you're not on the charge, so the blue bars, then it went down on average about 10%. And if you are on the charge, it went down by average of like 26% or so. But this guy is not meant to be necessarily a fighty dude. I mean, he's okay, but he's meant to be buffing those infantry units that he's adding +1 to combat to hit in combat attacks, which is the left ability there. And then he's also at buffing the control score of Kruleboyz unit. So he's meant to be more of a tech piece, and that's kind of the story we're seeing here. Also, his points might move around a bit, but yeah, this guy's just not your main killy dude, even though his name is Killaboss. Okay. Now, oh boy, so we straight out of one complicated unit to another one. Okay. First, there's a caveat that's important to say here. The Beast-skewer Killbow, the Warscroll that I currently have access to, is a Spearhead version. And to be fair, Spearhead does nerf some of the units. For example, the Carnosaur is probably the most nerfed Spearhead Warscroll I've seen thus far. But they do it just to kind of like balance things out so that the boxes are, the Vanguard Spearhead boxes are like, they're competitive against each other, right? So it could very well be that this thing has other buffs coming its way. But assuming it doesn't, I did all the math anyway, and you're going to see it's a lot of math. So what's the deal with the Beast-skewer Killbow? All right. It used to have 2 different shots when it was shooting, one based off of whether you moved or not. So staying still was better. That was the aimed fire. And then the hasty was if you moved and then you got a worse to hit and you had less range. So you're no longer penalized for moving. Now, if you compare the current weapon output to or stat line to the aimed shot, because it has the same range as the aimed shot, if I'm not mistaken, not counting the sub-faction bonus that you used to get, that I think it used to get. Anyway, it's +1 attack, so it doubled its output, but it's -2 to hit, so that hurts. But it got +1 to wound, so, kind of balances around there. Now, it used to have crits doing, because the venom encrusted weapons used to give it crit mortals based on its damage profile. And its damage profile we'll get to in a second. But now, crit to hit just does auto wound, which is kind of unnecessary because you're already wounding on 2+. That's the worst version of auto wound, by the way. It's still nice, but if it had a worse wound to wound profile, it's kind of like one of those don't look a gift horse in the mouth kind of situations, as we say in English sometimes, where I mean, a 2+ to wound is great, but personally, I think I'd rather it be 3s to hit, 3s to wound with crit auto wound than this way. But anyway, it is what it is. So how did the damage used to work? Well, so what happened was you got a flat damage characteristic of 2, and then you rolled a number of dice equal to the wounds characteristic of the target, and you only had one attack, so it was obvious what the target was. And for every 5+ you rolled, you added another point to the damage characteristic to a maximum of 12. So if you had like a 30 wounds target, and then of course because you're rolling 5 ups, on average you're getting 10 added. So once you hit 30 wounds, you added 10. On average you were rolling 10 5+s, and you would be adding those 10 to the base 2, which maxed out at 12. So as soon as your target hit 30 wounds characteristic, it statistically wasn't going to be doing any better because it would max out at 12. That said, of course, there's swinginess involved. You could roll less dice and hit 10, and that would be great. Or you could roll even more dice, like King Broad is 40 wounds characteristic, or wounds characteristic of 40, and maybe you roll low and you needed him to be those extra 10 wounds to guarantee that you get the full 12 damage characteristic. That said, it just wasn't happening all that much. Now, cool thing was, once you set the damage characteristic, if you auto hit, then what that did is it did that many mortal wounds. So if you got all the way up to 12 and you rolled a 6 on your one attack, by the way, and I say auto hit, but what I mean is if you crit hit, then it just went straight to that many mortal wounds, which of course is also skipping the rend step. You've got a decent rend here with a -2 on the new profile, but it didn't used to do all that when it was getting those crits, of course. Now we've just got a flat, well, not flat, but we've got a D6 damage. I really wish they had made it D3 plus 3 or something like that so that at least it could be a little bit more reliable, but it is what it is. So how did I process this? Well, we're going to see 4 graphs. We're going to see on this page hasty shot and aimed shot, left to right, with the same scale. This time I made sure they were the same scale so you could better compare them, against targets of wounds characteristic ranging from 1 to 5. Okay? So these are basically foot troops, like basic foot troops, all the way to basic foot heroes. Okay? If the old version was shooting at one of them, which is obviously not the target that you're shooting for with this unit because it's the Beast-skewer Killbow, it's meant to target big things, but not every game you're going to have a target that's more than 10 wounds characteristic. The average target that you can shoot at is going to be like probably 7 or less. And great, it's really great against Gargants, but that said, Gargants... There's nothing else in the game that's as big as Gargants. I mean, like Archeon's 25 with his newer version, but I mean, for a long time with Kruleboyz, you were lucky to see 15. You were happy to see 15. So right now we're just looking at shooting at low shots, and as you can see, it's gotten way better at shooting against small targets. As in like a health characteristic that's small. So if you're looking at wounds characteristic 1, it's something around 200% and 210% or so-ish better. And keep in mind, 200% better means 100% means double, so 200% means triple plus something on top. So it's like 3 times better, which is kind of crazy. And then even if you're shooting at wounds characteristic 5, it's about double. It's just below 100%. And that was with the hasty shot. Now, if you're comparing it to the aimed shot, it's a lot worse than what I just said because the aimed shot just had more accuracy. It didn't have necessarily more damage because it had the same ability, but it had a lot more accuracy. It was 2+ to hit, 3+ to wound. So anyway... you can see here that against a wounds characteristic of 1, it's around like, I don't know, a 105% improvement. And against wound characteristic of 5, it's sitting around like a 30% improvement. So can't complain. So the new version, the story it's telling here is it's just better against smaller targets than it once was. But let's look at the other side of the story. This is a sad part of the story. So if we look at the left-hand side, that's going to be our hasty shot. The hasty shot is a little bit mixed here. So I've put it down below as wounds characteristic 10, 15, 20, and then I skipped all the way to Gargant's size of 35. And by the way, that's 35 plus, but on average. So Broad would also fall into that group. Technically, it would be from wounds characters 30 or more, but 35 is even more certain that it'll be this. So if it's against a 10 or 15, we're seeing that as long as it has a 4-up save or worse, it's still a little better, and still on average better. And then for a 15 a wounds characteristic of 15, it's actually worse from a 3-up save or a 2-up save. But if it's wounds characteristic 10, it's positive the whole way. So that's still good news, I guess. And there aren't that many targets in the game ultimately that are bigger than 10. That said, everything that you would consider a monster is probably at least 10, if not a good bit bigger. So that's unfortunate. Looking at wounds characteristic 20, and again, this is the hasty shot, by the way. This is not the good shot. It's just a flat-out bad. It's about 70% worse. And against a Gargant, it's on average around 40% worse than it used to be. Now, that's with the hasty shot. Now, if we're on aimed, it's just negative across the board. I didn't even put it at the same scale because it didn't make sense to do so. We're talking about against a Gargant all the way down to 60% worse, and even against a 10 wounds characteristic 10 model, we're looking at about 10% worse. So I don't really know what they were trying to go with this, but again, like I said before, it's very possible that the Spearhead version of this is not what we're going to see in the real game. And I'll be happy to rework these numbers once I see what's actually going on. Okay, let's take a quick look at the melee. The melee got better, and the main reason is, even though it got -1 attack and +1 to wound, it gained crit mortals. How did it do that? Because this used to be a companion profile, and companion profiles didn't get to benefit because they technically got lumped in with mounts along with crew. They didn't get to benefit from the venom-encrusted weapons unless it said specifically, like on the corpse rip of Vulture. So you can actually see that, strangely, the Beast-skewer melee profile got way better, especially against a 2-up save. But this is more another indication of one of these things where the percentage is a little bit misleading here because it's not doing a lot. It's doing something around just a little bit above, like 3/4 of a wound or so, something like that. So I wouldn't read too much into this, but if it does come into combat, it survives a little bit better than it used to. All right, on to our last faction here, so that would be Ogors. All right, so Ogors had kind of a sad story with their faction focus. They lost a lot of speed. The battle traits seem to work against each other. They're not doing the impact hits they used to do. It's really kind of questionable what's going on with Ogors. But fun fact, or at least maybe the headline's lying, but I saw Haywo, who's like a known Ogors player, Beast Claw player. He did a review. He got evidently some kind of leak of all the new Warscrolls, and then like the caption was like, ? Are they actually good after all? So something like that. So maybe we're not seeing the whole picture here. I'm happy to come back and reevaluate my opinion of Ogors once we get the faction focuses. So this coming Tuesday is Order, Wednesday is Chaos, Thursday would be Death, and then Friday is Destruction right before the box comes out. Okay, so gluttons, what happened? First off, they had a paired weapons or a thing with like a splashback mortal wounds thing. They lost the splashback mortal wounds, so I didn't think it was fair to compare them to those. So I'm just comparing to the paired weapons. If you compare them with that profile, they're at -1 to hit, +1 to wound. Kind of monster-fied, which makes sense. They're kind of like on their way to being Gargants. Unfortunately, though, this is a big one. They lost their Gulping Bites ability, which all of the like regular Gut Busters have, which at the end of any combat phase, I think it was, you roll a D6 on a 4-up, they do D3 mortal wounds against a unit. Or I think it might be the reverse if any unit is in combat with these. So if you doubled up, it wouldn't double up, something like that. But anyway, if they both, assuming every one of these units went to tag a different enemy unit, they would be doing some mortal wounds. And their impact hits got worsened, which is part of the story I was talking about. They used to roll on the basis of their unmodified charge, which with Kragnos counted for more. Of course, the average charge was 7, so they'd roll that many dice, and then if the unit was 6 or 3 or more models, then they did mortals on a 5-up. Otherwise, it was a 6-up. And I just assumed the 5-up just to be generous for how it used to work. And this unit comes in a unit of 6, so you could lose half of them and still have it. But anyway, as you see here, their base output was the blue bars, and on average it's around a 12% decrease, and the impact hits a little bit more, especially against better saves, something around a 14% decrease. So it's a sad day for gluttons, but fortunately we've got a good story here with the Gorger Mawpack. Bad for people that feel like GW is just trying to sell new models, and this is a Warcry warband if I'm not mistaken, but anyway, the Gorger Mawpack, which has a more movement shenanigan teleport, well not teleport, but deep strike kind of thing, they got a big buff. Their melee got +2 attacks, but -1 to hit, but +1 to wound, so monster-fied. They also gained anti-infantry rend, which just stacks extra things. They lost gulping bites just like the ogres, and the impact hits got the gluttons, I mean, and the impact hits worsened as well. So right now we're looking at their base output, which is just looking at what the Warscroll is against itself. So we're looking at the base. This is not on the charge for the impact hits. So this is the base model. You can see, this is weird because it goes in 2 different directions. If it's not versus infantry, then it slowly gets worse. It's still better than the old profile in any case, but as the save gets better, it gets worse. And the expected value average is something around a 38% or so better across all saves. But if it's against infantry, because it's got the extra rend against the infantry, it just keeps getting better than the old profile, which did not have that happening. So its expected value average against infantry is around a 65% improvement. So these guys got buffed. Now, we're not looking at the charge yet. Let's go over there. So if you're charging, they're still better. This is including having lost the gulping bites and the impact hits being worse. Let's go and take, because something feels fishy about this. It's kind of a similar story, but let's go look at the Excel. So I'm going to pull over here. I was on Soulblight. Let's go to Ogors. So let's see, Gorger Mawpack. So I've got the old melee with the bites thrown in there, and then on the charge with the impact hits, and then we've got the new version, the base. The base max was with them with their +1 infantry rend. Then we've got the charge, and then also with the +1 rend, so charging into infantry. So I would just want to check a couple things here to make sure this all looks kosher. Yeah. That looks right. And then if I just look at what's going on here, so they're still on the charge, they're still getting some impact hits. What did I do wrong here? Did I do something wrong? No, it looks right. It looks right because the charge here in the old version was doing on average 2 1/3 with a 7-inch charge, and this is now doing on average 1 2/3. But the output is just so much better. I guess that's all it is the output is just so much better than what they used to be. There's a total of 26 attacks now, and they used to have 16, and it just does so much more work. So if we look at the 2 charts, we can look at it here as well. This is the base. You can see the scale goes all the way up to 100, and maybe that's why it's misleading here, is because I didn't do the scale. So let's say I came in here and changed the scale to 1.0, change that, and now you can see the 2 charts are more comparable to one another. So they're on the same scale, and then we can see that it is less, in fact, but it still is a notable improvement. So let's come back over here. So this is just zoomed in, if you will. So the expected value average when they're on the charge against infantry is just below 50, and then against on the charge but not against infantry is around 25%. So overall, this is a success story for the Gorger Mawpack. That said, they do have a 6+ save. They are pretty fragile, so keep that in mind. All right, last but not least is the big old Huskard, so the priest version of the 3 different riders of a Stonehorn. The Stonehorn is typically known as the more melee-oriented of the 2 big cows, and you have 3 different options. You had the Frostlord, which is like the big melee hammer, the Huskard, which is not that popular, it was a priest on the guy, and then you had the regular, like, I forget what their name was, but the regular riders that could be battle line. Okay, so what changed? We're going to look at the missile profile first. You had 3 choices. You had a chain trap, no one took. Harpoon launcher, no one took. Blood vulture, everyone took. We'll go through those in that order. The chain trap got a huge buff. It's +1 rend to maybe 2 if it's against a monster. So we're getting up to, it used to have no rend, otherwise the same profile. Chain trap is doing a whole lot better. So let's look at its profile down below. It's the blue one. It's doing, on average, something around, and this is a big scale, by the way, it's doing something around like a 40% on average improvement, or against a 2+ save, it's twice as good as it used to be. And that's not assuming it's against a monster. The orange is if it's against a monster, and then it's skyrocketing up to about a 200%, so 3 times as good of output. Again, it's not going to be doing that much. It can do at most 3 damage, so don't get too excited about that. But I do think the chain trap is probably the right move here, unless you're trying to go for a long-range shot for some reason. The harpoon launcher didn't change at all. Maybe the range changed, but the output didn't change. But I think the range did stay the same. By the way, it's worth pointing out the chain trap can no longer like ensnare a monster, but I think I'd rather still the output that it has here. It still has an extra point of rend even against not a monster, which is cool. And then finally the blood vulture. What a sad story for people that liked this, but I hated it, so I'm glad it's gone. Because it used to be board wide. Even if they just put a 24-inch range on it, I still think it would have been really strong because you picked a visible unit within range, but that was unlimited. And on a 2+, it did 1 mortal wound. And if you take like 3 or 4, maybe more of these guys on your list, and then you were pretty easily just sniping heroes left and right. And it wasn't even a shooting profile. It was like an ability. So they didn't have to follow the lookout start rules. It was just silly. But now they didn't have to go nerfing it this hard. It now has a shooting profile with a good hit and a good wound. No rend. That's rough. And so I said it's a regular profile with range as opposed to unlimited, and much less reliable because it has no rend. Mortal wounds are basically unlimited rend if you want to think of it that way. And then instead of being a 2+ to hit, it now has another filter step of a 3+ to wound, and then also that they get a save. And then it's still just doing 1 damage. So the blood vulture is the green down there, and it just got nerfed in every sense. Its expected value average is somewhere around 50-60% decrease. But the big thing is it's just the mortal wounds stacking them like that was just so strong. So R.I.P. Blood Vulture. I would take Chain Trap every day now, personally, because you probably want to be relatively close anyway. I could see an argument for the Harpoon Launcher if you don't want this guy to get close, but I'd probably go with the Chain Trap. All right, now we get into the melee stuff. Now I separate this into buffs and nerfs. In the section of what changed, I'm covering kind of everything, but the graphs will be changing based off of what got buffed and what got nerfed. Now, something that has to be said up front is I assumed if you're running these guys, you're running them in a faction or a formation, as they're now known, that benefits them. So the default setting before was the one that gave each one of the big cows +2 wounds characteristic, and then let them take like extra mount traits. It was the default setting for these guys, so I'm assuming that that's there. So, which meant they had a 16 health characteristic of 16 instead of 14. And then the new version of that, I think that the new version for these guys is where when they are on their charge, they get, if on a 3, like a D6 3-up or a D3 2+, if that goes off, then they get +1 to the amount of damage. So instead of being 2 or 3, if it goes off, it goes 3 or 4. I assumed that as well when doing the charge damage, though we're not looking at charge here. Now, why mention the wounds characteristic? Well, because, as I mentioned with Krondys and Karazai both got +2 to their wounds characteristic, which means if you compare them to the old one, for the last 2 wounds of its life cycle, it gets to perform at some amount of output, even though it's bracketed, instead of nothing compared to the old version. Well, the Stonehorns have the opposite story. Because as far as I'm aware, there's no way to boost their wounds characteristic anymore. Maybe a mount trait has it, and then it would be less notable. But what that functionally means is that I spread out, I assumed, we compared the old Huskard with 16 health characteristic to the new Huskard with only 14, which means the old one, even though it's quite bracketed at wounds, like the last 2 wounds it has, the new wounds that it's doing, the new version is just dead, so it's not doing anything. And keep in mind that actually makes that does have an impact here, because even though the new version Stone Skeleton is ignoring the first point of damage that would be allocated to it each phase, it no longer has a 5-up ward, and that 5-up ward did a lot of work before. So anyway, what are we talking about here? So the Rider got -1 to hit on the punches and kicks, but +2 to wound, so he's monstrified. The Horns got +1 to wound. It still does the +1 damage that was built in anyway, but it doesn't apply to the hooves anymore. So the hooves are at -1 to hit, but lost +1 to damage on charge. That said, their wounds like to wound roll used to be based on the brackets, and that no longer brackets, so that's nice. And then it had a buff on the Warscroll, which is a prayer that you could only give to one Beast-claw unit to give it +1 to wound across all of its profiles. I compared the buffed version here, which is what I say when I reference buff down in the chart below, like on the orange and light blue columns, that the buff that you were giving out on the old version was that prayer to himself, which of course was probably better on another unit, but let's be generous and give it to him. And now he's getting exploding hits with the red rampage ability, because you pick each friendly and enemy monster within this unit's combat range, and he counts as being within his own combat range, and he's a monster. And then the companion hits get crit 2 hits, which functionally is all out attack, or like +1 to hit. And you could even stack that with a +1 hit if you really wanted, but I didn't calculate that here, which would bump his hit roll functionally up to a 2-up on the companion attacks. But I am calculating that here. So what are we seeing in the chart? These are all the things where he got buffed. His base on his top bracket, meaning if you compare the current version to the old version's best bracket without getting any buffs, not being on the charge, it performs better. On average, we're seeing about a 7-8-ish% improvement. It's modest, but it's something. And maybe not what you would expect. And it kind of goes into the story that I've said a number of times in these videos, is that GW is making these units more reliable without having to have a bunch of buffs stacked on them. Just their default setting. Then if we look at the orange, that's going to be, So once again, looking at the top bracket, but if you put the buffs on. And what the story that we're seeing here is not on the charge, but just regular stuck into combat. If you got that prayer off on yourself for the +1 to wound, and you compare that to the ability that we now see for crit 2 hits on the companion weapons, the new version is way outperforming it at around an average of about 22-21% improvement. That's the orange bar. Now, if we look at the green bar, we go back to the base profile, but now we're looking at the average bracket. Now, what does that mean? Well, I took the kind of weighted average of each wound's worth of output across the bracket being considered to have equal amount of time to perform, and then divided by the total number of wounds. So, for example, in the old one, I think it was on the first bracket for 6 wounds worth, then it was on the next bracket for 3, then 3, and then 4 if it got the +2 extra wounds from this sub-faction, divided by 16. And then for the new one, I said, well, the first 10 wounds, because of how the bracket works, its horns are at 6 attacks, and then for the next 6 wounds, well, for the next 4 wounds, it was at 4 attacks, and then it was the whole Warscroll is dead for the next 2. Actually, it now occurs to me that I didn't calculate that correctly. So let's go look at the Excel and see if I can correct for that. What I would have to do, this is actually going to be maybe a little bit too hard, but I can kind of give you a sense for what I would have to do, because I realize now that what I did there was just counting. Let's see. Let's go. This is going to be hard to do, but I can give you one example of this. So let's say the new version is what I need to be looking at, so that would be over here. So I might have to come back and put a new graphic in here for you guys, but let's see. So what I need to do is, if you look at this, it's saying I'm going to do 10 wounds worth at this bracket and 4 at this, and then divide it by 16. And then maybe I did this right after all. Let me see. So that means it's functionally 2 times nothing. That it's doing no output for 2/16 of it. For 10/16 it's doing this, for 4/16 it's doing this, and then for 2/16 it's doing nothing. No, I think I did do it right. So just to let you see how that works, and I could show you how I did it on the old version. If we looked at a similar bracket, 6 wounds at this is at the top bracket, 3 wounds at the second best, 3 wounds at the third best or second worst, and then 4 wounds at the lowest one. So yeah, because it's assuming 0 output, because I could have said 2, what would that be? 2 wounds at 0 output, but 2 times 0 comes out to 0. So I did do it right. I just wanted to double check that instead of having to come back and correct it. But anyway, the point is that even against, so when he doesn't have any buffs going on, he's just kind of in combat, the green bar is what it is across all brackets, weighted evenly, even counting those extra 2 wounds that it doesn't get to fight. It's still performing better. And then if you put the buffs on, it jumps back up again. Now, let's look at where the story is not so positive. This is where we're on the charge. And the charge was fantastic for this unit. By the way, I didn't include the Everwinter thing because it only happened in your hero phase. It was like not attached to the combat phase, so maybe you had killed something, and it only happened once per battle round per these units, and it wasn't adding a whole lot of value, so I just didn't want to factor that in. It would be something like a half a wound, I think, if you spread it out over each turn. But anyway, don't just know that technically that's not represented here. Now, if you're on the charge with your top bracket, that's this blue, the dark blue, you're now looking at about a 12% decrease. And then if you're charged with the buffs, we're looking at a lot less of a decrease. So if you're comparing the 2 buffs, again, that's the crit 2 hits on the new version versus the +1 to wound, you're not actually that much worse, which maybe is really the story that we're looking at here. That's on your top bracket. You're just sitting around like a 1% decrease there. Really not that bad considering how bad it looked on paper. But if you're looking at your charge with the average bracket across your whole lifespan, and keep in mind the old version of the Warscroll, this is where it really shines, it's because it got to live for 2 extra turns. Then on an average bracket, we're looking at the green here, it's looking at about a 15% decrease, and then on the average bracket, even with buffs, we're looking at about a 7.5% decrease. It's still not as bad as I felt like it was when I looked at the Warscroll for the first time. But the charge did get nerfed. It really did. And remember, we're assuming you're in the formation that gives you +1 on that charge ability. That said, this guy is not your melee hammer. No one really loved taking this guy anyway. So, I don't know. I feel like, especially considering that Rampage is going to be unique to this, probably this, I don't know. We'll have to see if Everwinter's Code applies to also the Frostlord version. Because I could see a version where you take a Frostlord, the regular version, and the Huskard into combat, and they all try to get their rampages off at the same time and are like simultaneously buffing each other. That might actually give this guy more of a role to play, which is not bad. So I think we're just going to have to wait and see what happens, and we won't have to wait that long. All right. So there we go, guys. We did it. I actually did a video that addressed stuff that you guys wanted to see. There was someone who had asked to see Stormdrake Guard. I felt like since we have seen the Warscroll, but it was a leak, we'll just cover it at some other point. And the video is long enough as is. And then this allowed us to just focus on the other 2 Grand Alliance that we haven't seen any of my coverage. We've seen a little bit of Chaos, a lot of Order thus far. And now we got to cover the other 2. Death, of course, has not gotten that much attention, but still, it's something. And then someone said they wanted to see how I do the calculations for Excel. If you're really curious to see that, I did a relatively well-received follow-up, I guess, for a Math Hammer video, to our Sylvaneth Kurnoth Hunter's Swords and Scythes. That's where I go through the Excel doc with a good bit of, distinction there. So if you're really curious about how I do those kind of comparisons, that's a good place to start. Obviously, in every single one of these 4 videos, I've had an Excel section where I went over to the Excel to look at it. At least one moment where we did that. But of course, I didn't deep dive it. If you really, really want to see it, I'm happy to post a video. I don't think it's going to get viewed by a whole lot of people, but I'm happy to go into far more detail on the Excel for the nerds out there like me that love this stuff. Anyway, thanks so much, guys, for helping us reach the 3,000 subscribers. If anyone really wants to see any more of these videos, I could maybe entertain the idea, but I've got some other videos we need to get out before the faction focus, or the actual faction packs come out, and we're going to be swamped at that point. We've got a Lumineth video that'll be coming out, and you probably have seen that we had a Battle Tactics and GHB kind of video that came out either right before this or right after it. So in any case, we got lots to come, and I'm also going to be doing a video talking about kind of my summary of my mini games of 3rd edition and just what I thought about it, and also some graphs there. So anyway, guys, until the next time, Ryan out.